There's a special kind of loneliness that comes when your own children forget you exist. The phone stopped ringing, the holidays passed without a word, and 68-year-old Henry realized he was invisible in his own life. That's when he decided to leave it all behind. He packed what little mattered and disappeared into the woods, into an old cabin where no one would look for him. He thought he'd live out his days alone. But one morning, something woke him, loud grunts, heavy footsteps circling his cabin, wild boars, a whole family of them. And they kept coming back, day after day, bringing him food, helping him survive. Why would wild animals care for a man the world had forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Henry Caldwell had always believed that if you loved hard enough, gave enough of yourself, the people you cherished would stay. For 42 years, he'd lived by that principle. He'd been a good husband to Martha, a devoted father to Gregory, Pauline, and Kenneth. He'd worked double shifts at the lumber mill to pay for piano lessons and college tuition. He'd coached Little League on Saturdays and never missed a school recital, even when his back ached and exhaustion pulled at his bones. The wedding ring he now wore on a chain around his neck had once circled Martha's finger. She'd slipped it off 3 years ago in the hospital, her hand so frail he could see every vein beneath translucent skin. "Keep this close," she'd whispered. "Remember we were happy." Cancer had taken her in the spring, when the dogwoods were blooming and the world seemed determined to celebrate life while his was ending. The children had come to the funeral. They'd hugged him, told him they'd be there for him, promised Sunday dinners and holiday visits. Gregory, the eldest at 43, managed a software company in Seattle. Pauline, 2 years younger, taught high school English in Portland. Kenneth, the baby at 37, sold insurance in Sacramento. All of them successful, all of them busy, all of them, slowly but certainly, drifting away. At first, Henry understood. They had their own lives, their own families and obligations. He didn't want to be a burden. But the Sunday calls became bi-weekly, then monthly, then sporadic. Birthday cards arrived late or not at all. Last Thanksgiving, he'd set the table for 4, roasted a turkey the way Martha used to, and waited. No one came, no one called. The turkey went into the freezer in portions he'd eat alone for weeks. His apartment in the city felt like a mausoleum. 3 bedrooms for one old man. Photographs on every wall showing a family that no longer existed, at least not in any form he recognized. He'd sit in his recliner, Martha's favorite, and watch the phone. Sometimes he'd pick it up to make sure it still worked. The dial tone mocked him with its indifferent hum. He tried reaching out. He'd call Gregory's office, leave messages that went unreturned. He'd email Pauline articles he thought she'd enjoy, receive auto-replies about being away from her desk. He'd text Kenneth jokes and pictures of the garden, get back single-word responses days later. Busy. Swamped. Later. The worst part was the grandchildren. He had 5 of them, ranging from 4 to 16. He'd been there when each was born, held them in the hospital, promised to always be their grandpa. Now he knew them only through social media posts. He wasn't even tagged in. Birthday checks he mailed were cashed without acknowledgement. One evening in late October, sitting in the growing darkness of his living room, Henry looked at the pills on his coffee table. Blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, the little bottle of nitroglycerin for his heart. He realized he was maintaining a body that nobody needed anymore. He was keeping himself alive, out of habit, not purpose. That's when he remembered the cabin. His father, Silas, had built it in the Cascade Wilderness back in the 1962, back when a man could still claim a piece of forest and call it his own. Silas had been a logger like Henry, and he'd wanted a place to escape to when the noise of civilization became too much. He died 15 years ago, and the cabin had sat empty ever since, slowly being reclaimed by moss and vine. Henry had kept up the property taxes out of sentimentality, never intending to use it. But now, sitting in his empty apartment with the phone that never rang, the cabin seemed like an answer, not a retreat, an ending, a quiet place to let go. He didn't leave a note for his children. What would it say? "I'm leaving because you left me first?" That seemed cruel, and Henry had never been cruel. Instead, he simply packed clothes, a few books, Martha's recipe box, though he doubted he'd cook, the faded photograph he kept in his shirt pocket, the four of them at the beach when the kids were small, sand in their hair and joy on their faces. The drive took 6 hours, winding up through mountain roads that narrowed with each passing mile. The cabin appeared exactly as he remembered it, weathered log walls, a sagging porch, windows clouded with years of neglect. The roof had held, which was something. Inside smelled of pine and thyme and the particular loneliness of abandoned places. That first night, Henry sat on the porch steps and listened to the forest breathe around him. Owls called. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere distant, a creek murmured over stones. It was the first peace he'd felt since Martha died. He thought he might cry, but found he was too empty even for tears. He simply sat until the stars came out, more than he'd ever seen in the city, and then he went inside and slept better than he had in months. He spent the first days making the cabin livable, swept out 3 years of dust and leaves, got the old wood stove working, hauled water from the creek, chopped firewood until his shoulders ached. Physical labor felt good. It gave him something to do besides think, besides remember, besides wish his phone would ring, even though he'd left it behind in the apartment, plugged in and abandoned like everything else from his old life. A week passed, then 2. Henry fell into rhythms. Wake with the sun, coffee on the porch, chores through the morning, a simple lunch, reading in the afternoon, more chores, supper, early to bed. It was a sparse life, but it was his. No expectations. No waiting for people who would never come. He thought about Martha constantly. Sometimes he'd talk to her, tell her about his day as if she were sitting beside him. He wondered if she'd be disappointed that he'd given up, or if she'd understand. She'd always understood him better than he understood himself. The cabin held pieces of his father too. In the closet, he found Silas's old walking stick, carved from oak and worn smooth by decades of use. Tools hung on the wall, each one placed with the precision of a man who valued order. And in a wooden crate beneath the bed, wrapped in oilcloth, was his father's brass compass, the needle still true after all these years. Henry held the compass in his palm and remembered his father's words, "Sometimes a man needs to get lost before he can find his way." At the time, Henry had thought it was just something old people said. Now, at 68, standing in his father's cabin with nothing left but memories and regrets, he understood. He was lost, completely, utterly lost. And he had no idea that finding his way would begin with the strangest encounter of his life. The morning it happened, Henry woke before dawn as usual. The cabin was cold, frost patterns decorating the inside of the windows like nature's own artwork. He'd grown to appreciate these small beauties, the way sunlight caught on spider webs, how mushrooms pushed up through fallen leaves overnight, the particular smell of morning in the mountains. These things asked nothing of him. They simply existed, and somehow that was enough. He dressed in layers, pulled on his father's old work boots, and stepped onto the porch with his coffee mug. Steam rose from the dark liquid, mingling with his breath in the crisp air. November had settled into the forest with quiet determination. Soon snow would come, and Henry wondered distantly if he'd make it through the winter. His medication was running low. He'd have to drive into town eventually, face people and questions he wasn't ready to answer. But not today. Today he'd check the firewood supply, maybe walk down to the creek, see if any late salmon was still running. Simple plans for a simple life. Then he heard it. A grunt. Low and guttural, coming from somewhere near the woodpile. Henry froze, coffee halfway to his lips. Another grunt, followed by heavy footsteps and the sound of something large moving through underbrush. Bear, his mind supplied immediately. This was bear country, and he'd been careless, leaving food scraps too close to the cabin. His father would have been disappointed. Rule 1 of living in the wilderness: never invite trouble. Henry set down his mug slowly, quietly, and stepped back toward the cabin door. His hand found the handle just as the source of the noise emerged from behind the woodpile. Not a bear. Wild boars. A whole family of them. The sow was massive, easily 300 pounds, with coarse dark hair and tusks that caught the early light. Behind her trotted 4 piglets, smaller but no less intimidating, striped with the markings of youth. They moved with purpose toward his cabin, snouts to the ground, grunting and snuffling. Henry had seen wild pigs before, of course. They'd been a problem in the logging camps sometimes, tearing up equipment and frightening the horses. Dangerous animals, unpredictable and mean when cornered. Every instinct told him to get inside, bar the door, wait them out. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the morning light fell across the scene. Maybe it was the simple fact that after weeks of utter solitude, any living thing felt like company. Or maybe he was just tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. So he stood there and watched. The sow stopped about 20 feet from the porch, her small eyes fixed on Henry with an intelligence that unsettled him. She snorted once, then began digging at the ground with her powerful snout. The piglets joined her, rooting around in the earth near his woodpile. "Hey now," Henry said, his voice rough from disuse. "That's my property you're tearing up." The sow's head swiveled toward him. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the cold morning air. Then, deliberately, she turned back to her digging. Henry should have made noise, thrown something, scared them off. Instead, he watched. The family worked the ground for nearly 20 minutes before moving on, disappearing back into the forest as suddenly as they'd appeared. When he finally went to investigate, he found the earth torn up, but nothing taken, nothing damaged. Just holes where they'd been rooting for grubs or tubers. He forgot about it by afternoon. Wild animals did wild animal things. It meant nothing. But they came back that evening. Henry was inside reading when he heard the grunting again. He went to the window, and there they were, the sow and her piglets, this time near his porch steps. The sow had something in her mouth. She climbed the first 2 steps, the wood creaking under her weight, and dropped her burden before retreating. After she'd gone, Henry opened the door cautiously. On his porch step sat a pile of mushrooms. Chanterelles, golden and fresh, the kind Martha used to hunt for in autumn. Good eating mushrooms, valuable and delicious. He stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Coincidence? Had to be. The pig had been carrying them and dropped them accidentally. That was the only logical explanation, except she'd climbed his steps to do it, deliberately placed them there. Henry gathered the mushrooms and brought them inside, his mind working through possibilities. He'd heard stories, of course, old logger tales about animals acting strange, helping humans in times of need. But those were just stories, the kind men told around campfires to pass the time. They weren't real. The next morning, they returned at dawn. This time Henry was waiting, watching from the window. The sow approached alone, leaving her piglets at the tree line. She carried something dark in her mouth, a truffle, Henry realized as she deposited it on his porch. A black truffle, worth more than gold in the right markets. She looked directly at the window where he stood, as if she knew he was watching. Then she made a sound, softer than her usual grunt, almost conversational, and she left. Henry didn't go outside for an hour. He sat in his father's old chair, the truffle visible through the window, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Animals didn't do this. They didn't bring gifts. They didn't seek out human contact unless they wanted food, and he'd given them nothing. When he finally retrieved the truffle, he noticed something else. His woodpile, which had been getting low, had been rearranged. Someone, something, had moved the scattered logs into a neater stack, and near the base of the pile lay a freshly dug root vegetable, still covered in dirt. Henry's hands trembled as he held the truffle. Not from cold, from something else entirely, recognition maybe, or disbelief, or the terrible, wonderful possibility that he wasn't as alone as he thought. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the forest sounds, waiting for the grunt of the sow, the shuffle of piglets. What did they want? Why him? Why here? Around midnight, he heard them moving near the cabin. Not threatening. Just there. Keeping watch, almost. And for the first time since Martha died, since his children stopped calling, since he'd driven into these woods to disappear, Henry felt something he'd forgotten existed. He felt needed. The wild boars came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning thereafter, bringing gifts Henry couldn't explain, exhibiting behaviors that shouldn't exist. His isolation, it seemed, was over, whether he wanted it to be or not. On the 5th day, Henry started keeping notes. He'd found an old leather-bound journal in the cabin's storage chest, tucked beneath blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. Martha had given it to him years ago for Christmas, encouraging him to write down his thoughts, maybe keep a diary. He'd never written a word in it. What was there to say that wasn't already echoing uselessly in his head? But now he had something worth documenting, something that defied explanation and therefore demanded recording, if only to prove to himself later that it had actually happened. November 18th, he wrote in careful script. The sow returned at 6:47 this morning, brought wild berries, left them on the porch step. Piglet stayed back but watched. I'm calling her Hazel, my mother's name. Seems right somehow. Naming her felt like crossing a line, acknowledging that this was more than random animal behavior. But Henry was past pretending. Whatever was happening here was real, and it was extraordinary, and if he was losing his mind in these woods, at least he'd have a record of it. He started leaving things out for them. Vegetable scraps from his meager meals, stale bread he'd brought from the city, apple cores. Nothing fancy, but it felt right to reciprocate. The gifts they brought him, mushrooms, roots, berries, were keeping him fed better than his own foraging had managed. The least he could do was share what little he had. The piglets grew bolder by the day. On November 20th, one of them, the smallest, with a white patch on its shoulder, ventured onto the porch while Henry sat in his chair. It sniffed at his boot, grunted softly, then looked up at him with dark eyes that held more awareness than seemed possible. "Hello there, little one," Henry said quietly. His voice sounded strange, unfamiliar. How long since he'd spoken to anything other than memories? The piglet didn't run. It settled down near his feet, close enough that Henry could have reached out and touched it. He didn't. Not yet. But the fact that the animal trusted him enough to rest there, vulnerable and unafraid, made something crack open in his chest, a place that had been sealed shut since Martha's last breath. He talked to them after that. It started as commentary, "Looks like rain coming," or "That's a fine truffle you've found," but gradually became something more. He told them about his day, about repairs he was making to the cabin, about the hawk he'd seen circling overhead. And when the words came easier, he told them about Martha. She would have loved this, he said one afternoon, watching Hazel root through the fallen leaves. She always said animals knew things people didn't, said they could sense goodness in folks, sense when someone needed help. Hazel paused her digging and looked at him. Just looked, for a long moment. Then she went back to her work. The journal entries grew longer, more detailed. November 23rd. Hazel brings food every morning now, like clockwork. The piglets follow her lead. I've named the one with the white patch Piper because of the squeaking sound she makes. They're teaching me their patterns, I'm teaching them mine. We're learning each other. But alongside the wonder, old pain intruded. Henry couldn't help but compare. These wild animals, creatures he'd known for barely 2 weeks, showed him more care and attention than his own children had in 3 years. They checked on him daily. They brought him gifts. They stayed. One morning, while Hazel waited patiently for him to wake, Henry pulled out his phone, the one he'd left behind in the city but had brought in his truck without realizing it. He'd charged it once since arriving, just to see. 43 missed calls, the phone said. His heart had leapt. But they were all robocalls. Warranties expiring, political campaigns, not a single one from Gregory, Pauline, or Kenneth. He'd tried calling then. Each of them, one after another. Gregory's went to voicemail. "Hey, Dad," he'd said, hating the tremble in his voice. "Just wanted to check in. I'm up at the cabin, Grandpa's old place. Thought you might want to know where I am. Call me back when you can." Pauline's phone rang and rang. No voicemail, just ringing into a void. Kenneth answered. "Dad? This isn't a good time. I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" "Sure, son. Anytime." Kenneth never called back. Henry threw the phone in a drawer and didn't look at it again. What was the point? He'd left the city to spare himself this exact pain, the waiting, the hoping, the crushing disappointment. Here in the woods, at least the rejections were honest. A deer ran from you because you were predator. A bird flew away because you were threat. Simple, clean, not personal. But Hazel didn't run. Neither did her piglets. They stayed, and their staying meant something Henry was afraid to name. November 26th. I nearly fell today. Was fixing the roof, a section of shingles had come loose, and the ladder shifted. I grabbed for purchase, missed, felt myself going over. Then Piper squealed. Not a normal sound, a warning, urgent. And Hazel charged forward, pushed a log against the ladder base with her snout, steadied it. I swear on Martha's memory, that pig understood what was happening and helped me. He sat down after writing that entry, staring at the words. Reading them back, they sounded insane. Pigs didn't do things like that. They didn't comprehend human danger. They didn't intervene. Except she had. He'd seen it. Felt the ladder stabilize under him, made it down safely because of her actions. Henry walked outside to where Hazel lay in the afternoon sun, her piglets nursing. She cracked one eye open as he approached, but didn't rise, didn't run, just watched. "Thank you," he said simply. Her ear twitched. Nothing more, but it was enough. That night, Henry pulled out the stack of letters from his desk drawer. Letters he'd written to his children over the past 3 years, pouring out his loneliness and love and confusion. Letters he'd never sent because he was afraid they'd see them as manipulation, as guilt trips, or worse, that they wouldn't see them at all. He read through them by lamplight, seeing his own desperation on every page. "Please call," one ended. "I miss you so much," said another. "Did I do something wrong?" asked a third. He should burn them. That would be the healthy thing, the moving forward thing. Let go of what couldn't be changed. Instead, he wrote one more. "Dear Gregory, Pauline, and Kenneth," it began. "I want you to know I've found something remarkable here. I've found creatures who choose to care for me, not out of obligation, but out of something I can't explain. They're teaching me that connection isn't about blood or duty. It's about showing up. It's about staying. I wish I could have taught you that myself. I wish you'd learned it anyway. But I understand now that some lessons come from unexpected places. I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope someday you remember that I loved you, that I still do. Always, Dad." He folded it carefully and placed it with the others. Another letter he'd never send. Another piece of his heart committed to paper and filed away in darkness. Outside, Hazel grunted softly. The sound of her was becoming familiar, comforting, the sound of not being alone. Henry smiled despite the tears on his cheeks. For the first time in longer than he could remember, He went to bed feeling something other than empty. He felt grateful. December arrived with the first snow, light flakes that melted on contact but promised heavier weather to come. Henry had been in the cabin for 6 weeks now, and his life had developed rhythms he'd never imagined. Wake with the dawn, wait for Hazel, share breakfast, in a manner of speaking, her family rooting through the forest floor while he ate oatmeal on the porch. Then the work of the day, whatever needed doing, with the boars as constant companions. He'd found his father's old brass compass while organizing the tool shed, tucked in a rusted coffee can with spare nails and wire. The needle still pointed true north, despite decades of neglect. Henry cleaned it carefully, remembering the stories his father used to tell about getting turned around in the deep woods, how this compass had always brought him home. Sometimes, Silas had said, a man thinks he knows where he's headed. Then life spins him around and nothing looks familiar anymore. That's when you need something true to guide you back. Henry kept the compass in his pocket now, not because he needed navigation, he knew these woods well enough, but because it reminded him that being lost wasn't permanent. Direction could be found, even in confusion. His health had improved noticeably. The constant physical work, chopping wood, hauling water, maintaining the cabin, had strengthened muscles he'd let atrophy in the city. He slept better, breathed easier. Even his heart, that treacherous organ the doctors had given such grim prognosis, seemed to beat more steadily. Maybe it was the clean air, maybe it was having purpose again, or maybe it was simply being wanted, even if only by a family of wild pigs. The morning ritual evolved. Hazel would arrive first, announcing herself with a low grunt. Henry would open the door, greet her by name, and she'd deposit whatever gift she'd brought, nuts, mushrooms, sometimes just interesting stones that caught her attention. Then the piglets would tumble forward, Piper always the boldest, the others gaining courage from her example. Henry started building them a shelter. It began as a simple lean-to near the cabin, just some branches and salvaged boards to keep off the worst of the weather. But as he worked, the project grew more elaborate. He'd always been good with his hands, 40 years in the lumber trade, taught a man something about construction, and it felt good to create something with purpose again. Hazel watched him work with what he could only describe as interest. When he struggled with a particularly heavy beam, she'd position herself beneath it, taking some of the weight while he maneuvered it into place. But it happened too many times, too precisely, to be anything but intentional. "You're smarter than you have any right to be," he told her, securing the beam with nails. "Martha would say I'm anthropomorphizing. That's a fancy word meaning I'm seeing human traits where they don't exist. But I know what I'm seeing, girl." The shelter took 3 days to complete. When he was finished, he stood back to admire its sturdy walls, a sloped roof to shed snow, enough space for Hazel and all 4 piglets. That night, they moved in without hesitation, settling into the straw bedding he'd laid down as if they'd always lived there. Henry found himself smiling more. Small things would catch him, the way Piper hopped when excited, how one of the other piglets always ate facing north for some reason, the snuffling sounds they made when content. These observations filled his journal now, instead of loneliness. December 4th. Took Hazel and the family on a walk today. Didn't plan it, just started walking and they followed. We went down to the creek, about 2 miles through the forest. They stayed close, even when we passed through dense undergrowth. At one point Piper got ahead, and Hazel called her back with a specific grunt. Piper returned immediately. The discipline reminded me of teaching Kenneth to ride his bike, that same patient repetition until the lesson stuck. The memory ambushed him sometimes, these comparisons between past and present. Kenneth had been 7, determined to ride without training wheels like his older siblings. Henry had spent an entire Saturday running alongside that blue bicycle, holding the seat, letting go, catching him when he wobbled. By evening, Kenneth was riding solo, and the joy on his face had made Henry's aching legs worthwhile. When had things changed? When had his children started seeing him as optional rather than essential? A storm blew in on December 7th, fierce and sudden. Thunder cracked across the sky, rain hammering the cabin roof with percussive force. Henry sat inside, reading, comfortable and dry, when he heard scratching at the door. He opened it to find all 5 boars huddled on the porch, soaked and shivering. "Well, come on then," he said, stepping aside. They entered without hesitation, shaking water across his floor, grunting their gratitude. Hazel settled near the wood stove, her piglets pressed against her sides. The cabin filled with the earthy smell of wet animal and something else, the musk of wild things, taking shelter from the storm. Henry made tea and sat in his chair, watching them dry. The domesticity of the moment struck him. Here he was, sharing his living space with creatures that should be alien, dangerous even, yet it felt more natural than the empty apartment ever had. More like family than the silence of waiting for calls that never came. He read aloud to them as the storm raged. An old adventure novel he'd found in the cabin, something his father must have left behind. His voice filled the space, and the boars seemed to listen, their breathing slowing, their bodies relaxing. Piper fell asleep with her head near Henry's feet. When the storm finally passed and they filed back outside, Hazel paused at the door. She looked up at him, and Henry would swear until his dying day that her expression held gratitude, understanding, connection. "You're welcome," he said quietly. "Any time." That night he wrote in his journal until his hand cramped. Not just observations anymore, but reflections, thoughts about what it meant to be needed versus being loved. Whether there was a difference, whether it mattered. December 7th. The boars sheltered here during the storm. It should feel strange having wild animals in my living space. Instead, it feels right. More right than anything has in years. They don't expect me to be someone I'm not. They don't disappoint me by disappearing. They simply show up every single day because they choose to. When did I stop being someone my own children chose? Or did they ever? He closed the journal and looked out the window. Hazel's shelter was dark and quiet, all of them presumably asleep, safe, protected by the structure he'd built with his own hands. Henry hadn't felt this needed, this purposeful, since Martha was alive, maybe not even then. Martha had needed him, yes, but she'd also been independent, capable. Their partnership had been equal, balanced. These creatures needed him in a different way, and he needed them back. The loneliness that had driven him to these woods hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something else, something bearable, maybe even something close to peace. Outside, the stars emerged from behind the storm clouds, bright and innumerable. Henry watched them until sleep pulled him under, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't dream of empty chairs and silent phones. He dreamed of the forest, of grunting and snuffling and the soft sounds of creatures who stayed. Henry discovered the shortwave radio on a Tuesday morning while searching for extra blankets in the cabin's back storage room. It sat on a high shelf, covered in dust but surprisingly intact, his father's old emergency radio, the kind loggers used to carry into remote camps before cell phones made the world feel smaller. He brought it to the kitchen table, wiped it clean, and found batteries in the utility drawer that miraculously still held a charge. When he turned the dial, static crackled to life. Then voices emerged from decades of silence. News reports, weather forecasts, a classical music station playing something by Beethoven. The sound of humanity, transmitted through the air to reach him in his isolation. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it. Not people, exactly, but the reminder that the world continued beyond these trees, that somewhere life was happening, births and deaths, elections and weather patterns, the great churning machinery of civilization grinding forward whether he participated or not. Henry started listening in the evenings. He'd make dinner while voices filled the cabin, telling him about places he'd never visit and events that didn't concern him. It was comforting in a strange way, like watching the world through a window without having to open the door. On December 12th, he caught a nature program on the public radio station. A scientist was discussing animal intelligence, specifically the complex social behaviors of corvids and cetaceans. "We've greatly underestimated the cognitive abilities of non-human animals," the woman said, her voice crackling through the old speaker. "Recent studies show problem-solving skills, emotional depth, even something approaching empathy. The more we look, the more we find minds at work in unexpected places." Henry sat very still, his dinner growing cold on the plate. Was that what he was witnessing with Hazel? Not coincidence or wishful thinking, but actual intelligence, actual connection. The program continued, discussing cases of animals forming bonds across species lines. Dolphins protecting swimmers from sharks. Dogs adopting orphaned kittens. An elephant who stayed with her injured keeper for days, bringing him water. "The question isn't whether animals can think or feel," the scientist concluded. "It's why we've spent so long pretending they can't." Henry turned off the radio and sat in the growing darkness. If what he was experiencing with Hazel was real, genuinely real, not just the desperate imagination of a lonely old man, then it was extraordinary, worth documenting, worth sharing. But with whom? His children wouldn't believe him. They'd think the isolation had finally cracked his mind, and maybe they'd be right to think that. Maybe he was crazy, seeing meaning where none existed, projecting his need for family onto creatures who were simply following food. Except it wasn't just about food anymore. He'd tested that theory by not leaving scraps for 3 days. Hazel and her family came anyway, brought gifts anyway, stayed close anyway. 2 days later, Henry's solitude was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. He was outside splitting wood when movement on the trail caught his attention. A person, the first he'd seen in nearly 2 months. A young woman, maybe 30, with a heavy backpack and the careful gait of someone who'd been walking for miles. She wore hiking boots and practical outdoor gear, and carried what looked like a professional camera around her neck. "Hello," she called out, raising one hand in greeting. "Sorry to intrude. I think I'm lost." Henry set down his axe, suddenly aware of how he must look: wild beard, worn clothes, probably talking to himself as he'd grown accustomed to doing. "Where are you trying to get to?" "The ranger station at Miller's Pass. My GPS died about an hour ago." She pulled out a phone, showing him the dead screen with an apologetic smile. "I'm Cordelia Finch. I'm a graduate student, studying wildlife behavior patterns in the Cascades." Something in Henry went cold. Wildlife behavior, of course. "The ranger station is about 4 miles northwest," he said, pointing. "Follow the creek until you hit the fire road, then head west." "Thank you." She adjusted her backpack but didn't move. Her eyes had found the boar shelter, the fresh tracks in the mud, the evidence of Henry's unusual house guests. "Do you live out here alone?" "I do." "See much wildlife?" "Some." Henry kept his voice neutral. "Black-tailed deer, a few elk, the usual." Cordelia's gaze lingered on the shelter. "That's quite a structure. For what, exactly?" "Storage," Henry lied. She nodded slowly, and he could see her mind working, cataloguing details. She had the look of someone who noticed things, who asked questions and followed threads until they led somewhere interesting. Exactly the kind of person Henry needed to avoid. "Well, thank you for the directions." She started down the trail, then paused. "You know, I've been hearing reports of unusual animal activity in this area. Wild boar sightings, specifically. Behavior that doesn't match normal patterns. You haven't noticed anything like that?" Henry's heart hammered against his ribs. "Can't say that I have." Another long look at the shelter. "If you do, I'd love to hear about it. I'm camped about 3 miles south, near the old fire tower. Here, let me give you—" She fumbled in her pocket for a card, realized she didn't have any, and laughed. "Right, middle of nowhere. Look, if you see anything interesting, just come find me. Cordelia Finch. I'll be in the area for another week or so." She left, and Henry watched until she disappeared into the trees. Then he went inside, his hands shaking. Someone knew, or suspected. How many other people had noticed Hazel's family, remarked on their strange behavior? How long before Henry's sanctuary was invaded by researchers and cameras and questions he couldn't answer? That night, Hazel seemed to sense his agitation. She stayed close to the cabin, alert and watchful. When Henry came outside to check on her, she pressed her massive head against his leg, the first time she'd initiated physical contact. Henry's hand found her coarse fur, scratching behind her ears the way Martha used to scratch their old dog. Hazel made a sound of contentment, and Henry felt his anxiety ease slightly. "I don't want to share you," he said quietly. "Is that selfish? You're all I have, you and your babies. The only family that chose to stay." Hazel huffed, a sound he'd come to recognize as understanding, or at least acknowledgement. Henry looked up at the stars, thinking about the radio voices, about Cordelia's questions, about the world that kept pressing in even when you tried to leave it behind. He'd come to these woods to disappear. Instead, he'd found something so remarkable that it refused to stay hidden. He thought about his journal, filled now with detailed observations, about the photographs he'd taken with his father's old camera, documenting the impossible. Evidence of connection, of intelligence, of something the scientific community would find fascinating. But science meant exposure. Publication meant attention. And attention meant losing the only thing that made his life worth living. "What do I do?" he asked Hazel. She had no answer. She simply stayed, warm and solid against his leg, breathing in the cold December air. And for tonight, that was enough. Henry tried to forget about Cordelia Finch. He went about his routines, tended to his chores, spent his days with Hazel and the piglets as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. The sanctuary he'd built felt permeable now, vulnerable to intrusion. He found himself listening for footsteps on the trail, watching the tree line for movement that wasn't animal. 3 days after Cordelia's visit, Henry pulled out Martha's old recipe box. It was battered tin, painted with faded flowers, and inside were dozens of recipe cards in her careful handwriting. He'd brought it from the apartment without knowing why. He certainly hadn't planned to cook anything elaborate. But now, holding it in his hands, he felt the pull of memory and comfort. Beef stew had been her specialty. The recipe card was stained with ancient splatters, evidence of countless Sunday dinners. "Brown the meat first," it said in Martha's looping script. "Don't rush this part. Good flavor takes time." Henry didn't have beef, but he had venison from a deer he'd field-dressed 2 weeks ago, close enough. He started the process, browning the meat in his father's old cast-iron pot, adding vegetables he'd stored in the root cellar. The cabin filled with rich smells that transported him back to their kitchen in the city, to evenings when the whole family gathered around the table. Gregory would talk about school, showing off good grades. Pauline would tell jokes she'd learned from friends, butchering the punchlines and laughing anyway. Kenneth would be quiet, observant, soaking everything in with those thoughtful eyes. And Martha would orchestrate it all, making sure everyone got seconds, keeping the conversation flowing, turning an ordinary dinner into something sacred. When had they stopped doing that? When had the family dinners become occasional, then rare, then non-existent? Henry couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had been gradual, like watching someone walk away so slowly you didn't realize they were leaving until they were gone. The stew simmered for hours. When it was finally ready, Henry ladled some into 2 bowls and carried them outside. He set one on the porch step for himself and placed the other near Hazel's shelter. The sow emerged immediately, drawn by the smell. She approached the bowl, sniffed carefully, then began to eat. The piglets followed, all of them sharing from the single serving. Piper made her happy squeaking sound, the one that always made Henry smile. "Martha's recipe," Henry told them. "She would have fed you too, you know. She never could stand seeing anyone hungry, human or otherwise." He ate his own portion slowly, watching his strange family enjoy theirs. The act of feeding them, of sharing something he'd made with care and intention, felt like the most natural thing in the world. More natural than eating alone in his apartment, while reheated dinners congealed on TV trays. The next morning, Cordelia returned. Henry was on the porch drinking coffee when she appeared on the trail, this time carrying what looked like professional surveying equipment. She waved as she approached, her smile friendly but determined. "Morning," she called. "Hope I'm not bothering you." "You are," Henry said bluntly. She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know. I'm sorry, but I had to come back. I've been reviewing my trail camera footage from this area, and I'm seeing some remarkable things. Wild boar activity that doesn't match any documented behavioral patterns. They're returning to specific locations repeatedly, bringing food sources to one central point. It's extraordinary." Henry's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "That's so. I think they might be provisioning." Cordelia climbed the porch steps uninvited, her enthusiasm overriding social boundaries. "Do you know what that means? It's when animals cache food for future use, but more than that, it suggests planning, foresight, complex cognition, and if they're doing it near human habitation, that suggests something even more interesting. Maybe they're just pigs doing pig things. Maybe." Cordelia pulled out her camera, scrolling through images. "Or maybe something else is happening, something worth understanding. Look, I'll be honest with you, sir. Henry, I think those boars are interacting with you. I think you've formed some kind of relationship with them, and if that's true, if I'm right, it could be one of the most significant examples of interspecies bonding ever documented." Henry stared at her. She was younger than his children, earnest and excited, treating this like the scientific discovery of a lifetime, which maybe it was. But for him, it wasn't science. It was survival. It was the difference between wanting to live and waiting to die. "Even if that were true," Henry said carefully, "why would I want it documented? Why would I want strangers tramping through here, disturbing the peace? Because it matters." Cordelia sat down on the porch step, uninvited but somehow not unwelcome. Because understanding how and why animals form these bonds could change how we think about consciousness, about emotion, about our place in the natural world. And honestly, because I think you want someone to know, I think you've been out here alone with something amazing, and part of you wants to share it. She was wrong, wasn't she? Henry had come here to be alone, to disappear. Sharing meant exposure, it meant risk. But she was also right. Some small part of him, the part that used to believe in family and connection and being seen, wanted someone to witness what was happening, wanted validation that it was real. "I can't," he said finally. "I won't." Cordelia nodded slowly. "Okay, I understand. But can I just ask, why are you out here, Henry? A man like you, clearly capable, clearly intelligent, what brought you to the middle of nowhere?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Henry looked out at the forest, at Hazel's shelter, at the life he'd built from loneliness and desperation. "My children forgot I existed," he said quietly. "My wife died. I had nothing left worth staying for. So I came here to—" He stopped, unable to say the rest. "To die, to give up, to fade away. And then they found you," Cordelia finished softly. "The boars." "Yes. They saved your life." "I suppose they did." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I lost my father 2 years ago. We'd been estranged for 5 years before that. Stupid argument about something I can't even remember now. I kept meaning to call, to fix it, but I was busy and proud and sure there would be time later. Then he had a stroke. By the time I got to the hospital, he was gone. I never got to tell him I was sorry, never got to say goodbye." Her voice broke on the last word. Henry looked at her and saw his own grief reflected back. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Me too." She wiped her eyes roughly. "The thing is, I see you out here with these animals who chose you, who care for you, And I think about all the people in the world who don't have that, who are alone and forgotten. Your story could matter to them, Henry. It could remind them that connection is possible, even in the most unexpected ways. Henry didn't respond. He couldn't. Because she was reaching the part of him that still believed in meaning, in purpose, in the possibility that his life might matter to someone other than a family of wild pigs. Just think about it, Cordelia said, standing. I'm not going anywhere for a while. She left, and Henry sat on his porch for a long time, thinking about stories and witnesses and what it meant to be seen. Hazel emerged from her shelter and settled beside him, her solid presence a comfort. "What do you think, girl?" he asked. "Should we let the world in?" Hazel grunted, a sound he couldn't interpret. Henry pulled out his journal and stared at the pages filled with observations and reflections, evidence of something extraordinary, proof that he mattered, at least to these creatures. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe Cordelia was right. Maybe some stories were meant to be shared. He didn't know yet. But for the first time since arriving in these woods, he was considering the possibility that his isolation might not be permanent. That maybe, just maybe, being found wasn't the same as being trapped. The pain started while Henry was splitting wood. Not unusual pain, he was 68 and had been working hard all morning, but something different. A tightness in his chest that spread down his left arm like fire through dry tinder. The axe slipped from his grip. The world tilted sideways. Henry stumbled toward the cabin, one hand pressed against his sternum, the other reaching for anything solid. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. The porch steps seemed impossibly far away. Hazel's grunt cut through the fog. She was suddenly there, massive and solid, pressing against his side, not gently. She shoved him, hard enough that he staggered forward, caught himself on the porch railing. Another shove, this one driving him up the steps. All right, Henry gasped. His legs barely worked. His heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of his chest. Hazel didn't relent. She bullied him through the door with the determination of a creature who understood urgency. Henry collapsed just inside, his back against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room spun around him. The medication. He needed his medication. His fingers fumbled for the small bottle he kept in his shirt pocket. The nitroglycerin tablets that were supposed to keep his heart from killing him. He managed to get one under his tongue, tasting the familiar bitter tang. Then another. The world slowly stopped tilting quite so violently. Hazel stood in the doorway, too large to fit comfortably inside, but refusing to leave. She made a sound Henry had never heard before, low and distressed. The piglets gathered behind her, agitated and squealing. "I'm okay," Henry said, though it was clearly a lie. "Just give me a minute." But he wasn't okay. He knew that. The attack had been bad, worse than the ones before. Worse than the one that had sent him to the cardiologist 18 months ago, the appointment that had changed everything. The memory flooded back with painful clarity. Dr. Patterson had been kind but direct. "Your ejection fraction is dangerously low, Henry. We're talking about advanced heart failure here. With treatment, lifestyle changes, maybe surgery, we might buy you some time. But realistically, we're looking at 6 months to a year. 18 months if you're very lucky and very careful." Henry had nodded, absorbing the information with the strange calm of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "What if I don't do the treatment?" "Then considerably less. I'm sorry." He'd walked out of that office and sat in his truck for an hour, holding Martha's wedding ring, trying to understand how life had become something he was supposed to fight for rather than something he wanted to live. The diagnosis had felt like permission, in a way. Permission to stop pretending, permission to disappear. He'd never told his children. What would be the point? They'd already disappeared from his life. Adding guilt to their absence seemed cruel, and Henry had never been cruel. But now, sitting on his cabin floor with his heart trying to kill him and a wild boar standing guard in his doorway, Henry realized the full weight of his deception. He'd come here to die. He'd packed up his life, driven into these mountains, and settled into this cabin with the quiet intention of never leaving. The boars had ruined that plan. They'd given him reason to wake up each morning. They'd made him laugh. They'd needed him, and in needing him, they'd made him want to live again. He'd been taking his medication faithfully, eating better, working his body in ways that kept it strong. He'd been surviving despite his original intention. But hearts don't care about intentions. They fail when they fail. The door burst open fully and Cordelia appeared, breathless and wide-eyed. I saw Hazel acting strange from the trail. She took in the scene immediately. Henry on the floor, the medication bottle in his hand, his grey complexion. Oh my God, how long have you been having chest pain? Just now. It's passing. Like hell it is. She was already pulling out her phone. I'm calling for help. No signal, Henry said. Not out here. Cordelia swore, then knelt beside him, her fingers finding his pulse. When did you last see a doctor? Henry met her eyes and saw the moment she understood. 18 months ago, heart failure, terminal. Jesus Christ. Her voice cracked. That's why you're out here. You came here to die quietly. Yes. Henry managed a weak smile. But then these stubborn creatures wouldn't let me. Cordelia looked at Hazel, still standing in the doorway, her small eyes fixed on Henry with an intensity that seemed almost human. She knew. She pushed you inside, didn't she? She did. Wild animals don't do that, Henry. They don't intervene in medical emergencies. They don't understand heart attacks. I know what she did. Henry's breathing was easier now, the medication doing its work. I know what I saw. Cordelia sat back on her heels, her face a mixture of wonder and grief. This whole time, you've been out here dying, and these animals have been taking care of you. They've been giving me reasons to keep taking my pills. Henry touched his shirt pocket where the photograph lived, where Martha smiled out from a summer day 2 decades gone. My children stopped calling. My wife died. I had nothing. Then Hazel showed up with mushrooms and stayed. And staying mattered. Your children, Cordelia's voice was sharp now, they don't know you're sick. No. Why not? Because by the time I was diagnosed, they'd already left. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. They stopped returning calls, stopped visiting. I became optional in their lives. Telling them would have been manipulation. I didn't want their guilt. I wanted their love. And you can't guilt someone into that. Cordelia pulled out a small notebook, her hands shaking slightly. I've been documenting the boar behavior. I have footage, data, notes. What you're describing, what you've been experiencing, it's unprecedented. This level of interspecies bonding, this apparent understanding and care. If people knew, if your story got out, my children might see it. Henry finished the thought she was dancing around. They might realize what they've been missing. Yes, Henry closed his eyes. The pain in his chest had subsided to a dull ache, manageable. But the pain in his heart, the old wound of abandonment, felt raw and fresh. What if they don't care? What if they see it and still stay away? Then at least you'll know, Cordelia said gently. At least you won't spend whatever time you have left wondering if they might have come, if they'd only known. Outside, Hazel grunted. Piper squeaked in response. The sounds of his found family, the creatures who'd chosen him when his own blood had not. Henry opened his eyes and looked at Cordelia. She was young, driven, full of the passionate certainty that truth mattered. Maybe she was right. Maybe his story deserved to be told. Maybe the world needed to know that connection was possible, even in the deepest loneliness. Or maybe he was just a dying old man who wanted his children to remember he'd existed. If we do this, Henry said slowly, it has to be honest. Not sensationalized, not made into some feel-good story that ignores the hard parts. The hard parts are what make it matter, Cordelia said. And if my children see it and still don't come, Then you'll still have them. Cordelia gestured toward the doorway where Hazel waited. Your real family. The ones who stayed. Henry looked at the boar, at her patient, protective stance, at the piglets behind her, agitated and concerned, at the evidence of love that transcended species and logic and everything he'd thought he understood about the world. All right, he said finally, tell the story, all of it. Let's see what happens when the truth comes out. Cordelia moved quickly once Henry agreed. She spent the next week at the cabin, documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. She set up cameras to capture the daily routines, interviewed Henry for hours, recorded the sounds of the forest and the specific grunts Hazel used to communicate. Henry showed her his journal, pages filled with observations and reflections, the detailed maps he'd drawn of their walking routes, the sketches of Hazel and the piglets. Evidence of connection built over months of isolation. This is incredible, Cordelia said, reading through entries. The level of detail, the patterns you've identified. Henry, you've been conducting field research without even realizing it. I was just trying to understand them. That's what all good science is. Trying to understand. She filmed him preparing meals, sharing food with the boars. Captured the moment when Piper climbed into his lap like a house pet, settling against him with complete trust. Got footage of Hazel pushing logs into place while Henry repaired the shelter roof, her assistance unmistakable. The most powerful footage came accidentally. Henry was talking about Martha, about how the grief had hollowed him out, and he started crying. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears running down his weathered face. Hazel approached immediately, pressed her snout against his knee, made that soft sound of comfort. The camera captured all of it, raw emotion and impossible empathy. I'm going to send this to a producer I know, Cordelia said on the 5th day. Someone I trust. He does nature documentaries for PBS, handles sensitive material with respect. Henry's stomach churned with anxiety. Then we wait. If he thinks it's strong enough, it might air on their regional station. Maybe get picked up nationally if it resonates. And my children might see it. They might. Cordelia put down her camera. Or they might not. But other people will. People who are lonely, who think they're forgotten. Your story could matter to them, Henry. It could remind them that connection finds us in unexpected ways. Henry pulled out the bundle of unsent letters from his desk drawer. Dozens of them, years of unspoken love and longing addressed to children who'd stopped listening. Should I include these? Cordelia read a few, her eyes growing wet. Only if you want to. They're very personal. If we're telling the truth, we should tell all of it. Henry selected one, the last one he'd written. This one, just this one. They filmed him reading it aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion. Dear Gregory, Pauline and Kenneth, I want you to know I've found something remarkable here. I've found creatures who choose to care for me, not out of obligation, but out of something I can't explain. They're teaching me that connection isn't about blood or duty. It's about showing up. It's about staying. I wish I could have taught you that myself. I wish you'd learned it anyway. But I understand now that some lessons come from unexpected places. I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope someday you remember that I loved you, that I still do. Always, Dad. The footage was devastating. Even Cordelia had to step away afterward, composing herself before continuing. 3 weeks later, the documentary aired on the regional PBS affiliate, 22 minutes of Henry's story, told with honesty and care, the abandoned father, the terminal diagnosis, the wild boars who refused to let him die alone. His letter to his children, read in his quiet, dignified voice. Within 48 hours, it had been shared 10,000 times online, then 100,000, then millions. The comments poured in from strangers around the world. I'm calling my father tonight. This made me sob. Those children should be ashamed. What an incredible bond. Animals understand more than we give them credit. 4. News crews appeared on the trail, camping at the forest boundary. Henry's phone, the one he'd abandoned months ago, suddenly had service from a cell tower boost brought by the media attention. It rang constantly with numbers he didn't recognize, producers, journalists, talk shows. Cordelia managed them all, fierce in her protection of Henry's privacy. No interviews without permission, no approaching the cabin. If you want the story, you have it. Leave him alone. But Henry couldn't leave his phone alone. He checked it obsessively, scrolling through missed calls and messages, looking for 3 names: Gregory, Pauline, Kenneth. They never appeared. Days passed. The story grew bigger. A morning show producer reached out with an offer. National television, millions of viewers, a chance to tell his story to the entire country. "I don't want fame," Henry told Cordelia. "I just wanted my children to know." "Then maybe this is your last chance," she said gently. "One final message they can't ignore." Henry sat on his porch that evening, Hazel beside him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. His heart felt tired, not the medical kind of tired, though that was there too, but the exhaustion of hope deferred too many times. "What do I do, girl?" he asked. Hazel grunted, her warm breath clouding in the cold air. Henry thought about his children, about the years of silence, about the grandchildren who didn't know his voice, about a family that had scattered like seeds on the wind, never taking root where they'd been planted. And he thought about the family he'd found instead, creatures who brought him food, who sheltered with him in storms, who pushed him toward safety when his heart tried to quit, who stayed. "All right," he said finally. "One more time, one more chance for them to see me." He called the producer back and agreed to the morning show appearance. They'd film at the cabin, he insisted. He wouldn't leave Hazel, wouldn't abandon the only family that had refused to abandon him. The crew arrived 3 days later. Lights, cameras, a host with perfect teeth and practiced empathy. They set up on his porch while Hazel watched from a distance, protective and wary. "Ready?" the producer asked. Henry touched the photograph in his pocket. Martha's face, faded but still smiling. Then he looked at Hazel, at Piper, and the other piglets. At the life he'd built from despair and loneliness. "Ready," he said. The interview would air in 2 days. And then the whole country would know his story, including, perhaps, the 3 people he most wanted to reach. The morning show segment aired on a Thursday at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Henry didn't watch it. He couldn't bear to see himself on screen, to hear his own voice speaking truths he'd kept buried for so long. Instead, he sat on the porch with his coffee, Hazel at his feet, and waited for nothing in particular. Cordelia called at 8. "Henry, it's exploding. The network's phone lines are jammed. Social media is on fire. People are crying, calling their parents, sharing their own stories of estrangement. You've touched something deep." "Have my children called?" A pause. "Not yet. But it's only been an hour. Give them time." Time. Henry had given them 3 years of time. How much more did they need? By noon, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. "Dying father found family in wild boars after children abandoned him," the headlines read. Some were more sensational. "You won't believe what saved this lonely dad's life." Others focused on the science. "Unprecedented interspecies bond challenges, our understanding of animal intelligence." The comments section became a battleground. Strangers defending his children. "We don't know their side of the story." Others attacking them. "How dare they abandon their dying father?" Some focused on the beauty. "This restored my faith in connection." Others on the tragedy. "That anyone should die alone breaks my heart." Henry read them all, searching for meaning in the opinions of people who didn't know him, trying to understand what his story meant to the world when he couldn't understand what it meant to himself. Cordelia stayed close, fielding calls, turning away journalists who'd found their way up the trail. She'd become something like a friend, this young woman who'd stumbled into his isolation and refused to let him hide. She understood grief. She understood regret. She understood what it meant to lose family before you were ready. My father would have loved this, she said that afternoon, watching Hazel teach her piglets to forage for grubs. He always said animals were better judges of character than people. I used to think he was just cynical. Now, I think he was right. You still miss him. Every day. Especially now, seeing what you have with them. With your children, I mean. Or what you could have. I'd give anything for one more conversation with my dad. To tell him I was wrong, that the argument didn't matter, that I loved him despite everything. Your children still have that chance. They just have to take it. But would they? Henry had learned not to hope. Hope was dangerous. It built you up just to tear you down harder when it collapsed. That evening, as the sun set and the forest grew quiet, Henry's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, tired of journalists and producers and strangers with opinions, but something made him pick up. Dad? The world stopped. That voice. He knew that voice. Pauline? Oh God, Dad. She was crying. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I saw the show this morning. I've been trying to reach you all day, but your line was busy, and I didn't know if you'd even want to hear from me after. Stop. Henry's own voice cracked. Just stop. Where are you? Portland. But I'm coming. I'm already packed. I've been driving for 2 hours. I should be there by tomorrow afternoon. Dad, I didn't know. About your heart. About how lonely you were. About any of it. We just got busy and stupid and selfish, and I thought you were fine, that you wanted space after Mom died. But watching you on TV, seeing those animals taking care of you, because we didn't. She broke down completely then, sobs coming through the phone so raw that Henry felt his own tears start. It's okay, he said, though it wasn't. Not yet. Just come. Please come. I will. I promise. And Dad? I called Gregory and Kenneth. They saw it too. They're coming. We're all coming. Henry couldn't speak. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand. I love you, Pauline said. I never stopped. I just forgot to show it. But I'm showing it now. I'm coming home. She hung up, and Henry sat in the gathering darkness, trying to process what had just happened. 3 years of silence, broken, his children coming back to him. Not out of guilt, maybe, or not only guilt, but coming nonetheless. Hazel nudged his hand with her snout. Henry looked down at her, this creature who'd saved his life in ways both literal and profound. They're coming, he told her. My children are coming. She grunted, a sound he'd learned meant understanding, acceptance. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He cleaned the cabin, made up the spare beds, tried to prepare for a reunion he'd stopped believing would ever happen. His hands shook as he worked. Fear and hope warred inside him. What if it went wrong? What if they came out of obligation and left again as soon as possible? What if the gap was too wide to bridge? But they were coming. That had to mean something. Around midnight, he heard a car engine on the distant fire road. Too soon for Pauline. He went outside and saw headlights approaching, a vehicle navigating the rough trail with determination. The car stopped near the cabin. The door opened. Pauline stepped out. She'd driven through the night, unable to wait until morning. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red from crying. She looked at Henry standing on the porch, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she ran to him, and Henry caught her, and they held each other like people drowning, like people saved. His daughter, his little girl, back in his arms after years of absence that felt like death. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm so sorry. You're here, Henry answered. That's what matters. You're here. Behind them, Hazel watched from her shelter, patient and protective. The father had his family back. But she would stay close anyway, just in case. Because that's what family did. They stayed. Pauline stayed up with Henry until dawn, talking in the way they hadn't talked in years. She told him about her marriage struggles, her teenage daughter who'd started pulling away, the mounting pressure of teaching in underfunded schools. All the reasons she'd let herself get too busy, too overwhelmed to call her father. "None of it's an excuse," she said. "I just got lost in my own life and forgot you were waiting in yours." Henry listened, holding her hand across the kitchen table. Martha's recipe box sat between them, and Pauline kept touching it, tracing the faded flowers with her fingertips. "Mum would be so disappointed in us," she whispered. "Your mother would be grateful you're here now." Henry squeezed her hand. "That's what matters, not the time we lost, the time we have left." Morning brought Gregory and Kenneth. They arrived within an hour of each other, both having driven through the night from opposite directions. The reunion was awkward at first. 3 middle-aged children facing the father they'd abandoned, shame and love and confusion mixing into something none of them knew how to navigate. Gregory broke first. He'd always been the stoic one, the responsible eldest who held everything together. But seeing Henry thinner than he remembered, older, the evidence of illness visible in the grey cast of his skin, shattered something inside him. "I failed you," he said simply. "I was so wrapped up in keeping my company afloat, in proving I was successful, that I forgot what actually mattered. I forgot you." Kenneth said nothing at first. He just walked to his father and embraced him, holding on like he used to as a child after nightmares. Henry felt his youngest son's shoulders shake with silent sobs and held him tighter. "I was afraid," Kenneth finally said. "After Mum died, I was so afraid of losing you too that I just stayed away. Like if I didn't get close, it wouldn't hurt as much when you were gone." "How stupid is that?" "Not stupid," Henry said. "Human, just human." They spent that first day relearning each other. Henry showed them the cabin, the improvements he'd made, the life he'd built in isolation. He introduced them to Hazel and the piglets, and they watched in amazement as the boars approached without fear, as Piper climbed into Henry's lap, as Hazel pressed against his leg with obvious affection. "It's real," Pauline breathed. "We thought maybe the documentary exaggerated, but it's completely real." "They saved me," Henry said. "When I came here ready to give up, they gave me reasons to keep going." The words hung in the air, an indictment none of them could deny. Animals had done what his children had not. They'd shown up, day after day, with no expectation of return. They'd made him matter. "We should have been the ones," Gregory said, his voice thick. "We should have been here. You're here now." But the reconciliation wasn't simple. Years of hurt couldn't be fixed in a single day. That evening, after dinner made from Martha's recipes, the conversations grew harder. Questions emerged. Why hadn't Henry told them about the diagnosis? Why had he disappeared without explanation? Why had he let them believe he was fine? "Because you'd already left," Henry said quietly. "Not physically, but in every way that counted. Telling you I was dying felt like manipulation. I wanted you to come because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated." "That wasn't your choice to make," Pauline said, anger breaking through her guilt. "We deserved to know. We deserved the chance to be there. You had chances, 3 years of chances, every unanswered call, every forgotten birthday, every holiday you were too busy for." The words were harsh but necessary. The truth, finally spoken after years of silence. Kenneth stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. "So what now? We apologize and everything's fine?" "We can't give you back those years, Dad. We can't undo the damage." "No," Henry agreed. "You can't. Then what do you want from us?" Henry looked at his 3 children, all of them damaged by the years of distance, all of them struggling with guilt and grief and the terrible knowledge that they'd almost lost him forever. What did he want? Forgiveness? Revenge? Some magical restoration of what they'd once been? "I want you to stay," he said finally. "Not forever, not even for long. Just stay for now. Be here. Let me know you again. Let me meet my grandchildren. Let me have whatever time is left with people who choose to be here, not people who feel they have to be." "We do choose," Pauline said fiercely. "We choose you, Dad. We always did. We just forgot how to show it." "Then show me now." They did. Over the next 3 days they stayed at the cabin, sleeping in cramped quarters, cooking together, talking until late into the night. They shared stories. Henry had missed his grandchildren's achievements, family dramas, small moments that made up the texture of life. And Henry shared his stories too. The months of isolation, the strange and beautiful relationship with Hazel, the lessons he'd learned about connection and choice. Cordelia came by on the 3rd day, bringing supplies and news. The story's still growing. People are calling it the most moving piece of the year. But more importantly, she pulled out her tablet, showing them messages. Thousands of families are reconciling. Adult children reaching out to parents, parents swallowing their pride to call kids. "You've started something, Henry." Henry looked at his own children, gathered around the table where he'd eaten alone for months. "I didn't mean to start anything. I just wanted them to know I existed." "You did more than that," Gregory said. "You showed people what matters, what's worth fighting for." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Henry sat on the porch, surrounded by both his families, his children on one side, Hazel and the piglets on the other. The completeness of it made his chest ache, but not from his heart condition, from gratitude, from the impossible gift of second chances. "Thank you," he said to Hazel, scratching behind her ear, "for everything." She grunted, settled more comfortably against his leg, and watched the stars emerge. His children were home, not the home he'd left behind, but this new home he'd built from loneliness and grace. And for now, that was enough. 6 months passed before Henry agreed to leave the cabin, even temporarily. His children had returned to their lives, but this time with a difference. They called every Sunday without fail. They visited monthly, sometimes bringing the grandchildren, who approached Hazel with the same wonder Henry had felt that first morning. Gregory set up a video system so Henry could see them between visits, their faces filling the screen with life and laughter. The cabin became a gathering place. Thanksgiving brought all 3 families together, crowded and chaotic, and exactly what Henry had stopped believing was possible. They cooked Martha's recipes from the tin box, and Henry told stories about their mother that made them laugh and cry in equal measure. Pauline convinced him to move closer to Portland, not into the city, but near enough that she could check on him regularly. "Keep the cabin," she insisted. "Come back whenever you want, but let us be nearby. Let us be part of your life." Henry agreed, but only after securing a property with enough land for Hazel to visit. He couldn't abandon her. Wouldn't. She'd saved him when saving seemed impossible. The arrangement worked better than anyone expected. Henry spent summers at the cabin, winters near Pauline's family. The boars adapted, following their own mysterious rhythms, but always returning when Henry was there. Cordelia continued her research, documenting what she called the most significant case of interspecies bonding in modern behavioral science. The documentary won awards. Henry became, much to his discomfort, something of a celebrity. He appeared on talk shows, wrote an article for a nature magazine, received letters from thousands of people who'd been moved by his story. But what mattered most were the other letters, the ones from adult children who'd called their parents after years of silence, from lonely, elderly people who'd found hope in his tale of unexpected connection. "You started a movement," Cordelia told him during one visit. She'd become like a 4th child, checking in regularly, sharing her research findings, bringing news from the outside world. "I just told the truth," Henry said. "Sometimes that's enough." His health stabilized. The doctor called it remarkable, nearly miraculous. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, doctor," Patterson said during a checkup. "Your numbers are better than they've been in years. You might have more time than we thought." Henry knew what was different. He had reasons to take his medication now, reasons to eat well, to rest when tired, to fight for every additional day. His grandchildren needed him. His children needed him. Hazel needed him. and he needed them back. One afternoon in late spring, Cordelia arrived at the cabin with her camera and a request. "One final piece," she said. "A follow-up, showing where you are now, how the story ended." Or didn't end. Henry agreed, and they spent the day filming. His children came, their families in tow. The grandchildren played in the forest, while Hazel's latest litter, Piper, had become a mother herself, explored the world with piglet curiosity. They took a photograph. All of them together, Henry, Gregory, Pauline, Kenneth, their spouses, the grandchildren. And in the foreground, lying peacefully, Hazel and her extended family, two families, connected by the strange alchemy of need and choice and love that transcended species. Cordelia snapped the picture, and Henry knew immediately it would replace the faded photograph in his pocket. Not because the old one didn't matter anymore, but because this one showed what came after grief. What was possible when you stopped waiting for life to return and started building something new. That evening, after everyone had left and quiet returned to the forest, Henry sat on the porch with his journal. The leather was worn now, pages filled with 2 years of observations and reflections. He turned to a blank page and began writing his final entry. "I came to these woods to disappear. I packed my life into a truck, drove into the mountains, and settled into my father's old cabin with every intention of fading away quietly. I was 68 years old, sick and forgotten, with no reason left to fight. Then Hazel found me, or I found her, or maybe we found each other in the way all important things are found by accident and grace, and the mysterious workings of a world that refuses to let us die alone. She taught me that family isn't only blood, that connection isn't only human. That showing up matters more than every pretty word we speak, but never act on." My children came back, not because I guilted them, but because they saw what these creatures showed them, that love is a choice you make every single day. You show up, you stay. You do the work of caring, even when it's inconvenient. I don't know how much time I have left. Could be months, could be years. My heart is still failing, still counting down to some inevitable ending. But I'm not afraid anymore, because I know now that I won't die alone. I won't die forgotten. I'll die, surrounded by family, both the one I was born to and the one that chose me when I'd given up hope. If you're reading this someday, whoever you are, remember, connection finds us in unexpected places. Sometimes it looks like a phone call. Sometimes it looks like a wild boar bringing mushrooms to your door. What matters is recognizing it when it comes. What matters is staying, always staying. Henry closed the journal and looked out at the darkening forest. Hazel emerged from her shelter, stretching in the evening air. She climbed the porch steps and settled beside him, her warmth a comfort against the growing cold. "Thank you, girl," Henry said, scratching behind her ear. "For everything," she grunted softly, contentedly. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The forest breathed around them, alive and vast and full of mystery. Henry touched the new photograph in his pocket, his family, all of them, together at last, and smiled. He'd come to these woods to die. Instead, he'd learned how to live again, and in the end, that made all the difference.